In the heart of Lucknow, a city on the edge of chaos, Britain's garrison didn't yet know their world was about to collapse. The summer of 1857 in India was simmering with tension. What had started as scattered mutinies among sepoys in Meerut had quickly spread like wildfire, igniting a revolt that threatened to topple British authority across the subcontinent. Lucknow, the capital of Oudh, was a city of elegance, its narrow streets and grand palaces reflecting centuries of Indian royalty. Yet behind its walls, British officers and civilians sensed an imminent storm they could neither fully grasp nor prepare for. Among them was Sir Henry Lawrence, the British resident of Oudh, a man whose calm authority had earned him respect from both his troops and the local population. Lawrence knew that rebellion had already reached the outskirts, and intelligence reports painted a dire picture. The sepoys, driven by anger and resentment, were uniting under the banners of defiance. Their numbers were growing, and their determination was frightening. What made matters worse for the defenders was the city itself, dense, labyrinthine, and difficult to control. Every alleyway could conceal a hidden enemy, every palace could serve as a fortress. Preparations for the inevitable siege began quietly. Supplies were stockpiled within the Residency, the fortified British enclave in the city. Civilians, families of officers, bureaucrats, and merchants were advised to move in for safety. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, practicing formations, yet the fear of the unknown hung like a shadow over every face. Even as Lawrence inspected the fortifications, adjusting barricades and reinforcing gates, there was a sense that no amount of preparation could fully counter the fury of a city rising against its rulers. The first attacks were subtle, almost insidious. Reports came of isolated skirmishes, of patrols ambushed along side streets, and of messages intercepted suggesting a larger, coordinated assault was imminent. The British garrison was seasoned, but they had not faced a rebellion of this scale, and the atmosphere was charged with tension. Each passing day increased the stakes. A wrong move could spark full-scale chaos. As July gave way to August, the signs became undeniable. Rebels were moving through the city in larger numbers. Rumors of massacres in neighboring towns reached the Residency, painting a grim picture of what might await those trapped behind its walls. Civilians, initially skeptical, now looked to the soldiers for reassurance, while officers quietly calculated how long their supplies might last if the city fell into full revolt. Lawrence convened his commanders in hushed meetings, his voice steady but eyes betraying the weight of responsibility. Despite the fear, there was no panic yet. The garrison clung to routine, drills, inspections, and correspondence with other British posts. But every passing hour brought the city closer to the inevitable clash. The calm before the storm was a dangerous illusion. Beneath the surface, tension simmered, waiting for the first spark. It was in those quiet, tense days that the defenders of Lucknow unknowingly stood at the precipice. Each soldier, each civilian, and each officer felt it, the sense that their lives and the empire's reputation were on the edge. The walls of the Residency would soon be tested in ways no one could predict, and what had seemed a manageable situation was about to spiral into a desperate fight for survival. But as the first shots echoed through the city, it became clear Britain's defense was about to break. The first roar of cannon fire shattered the uneasy calm. Lucknow had become a city at war. By early July 1857, the signs of rebellion in Lucknow had crystallized into action. The sepoys, bolstered by local insurgents, moved decisively against the British Residency. What had been a simmering tension erupted into relentless violence. From the narrow streets to the fortified gates, the city became a labyrinth of threats. Every corner seemed alive with danger, every shadow potentially hiding an enemy. For the defenders, the siege was no longer a distant possibility, it was a brutal reality. The Residency, a complex of high-walled buildings and fortified enclosures, became the refuge for hundreds of British soldiers, their families, and loyal civilians. It was meant to be impregnable, but the sheer number of rebels surrounding them made its defenders uneasy. Lawrence and his officers quickly organized the garrison. Men were assigned to guard towers, patrol walls, and reinforce weak points in anticipation of the coming assault. Civilians were trained in basic defense, instructed on how to support soldiers while minimizing their own exposure to deadly crossfire. Every hour was a test of strategy, courage, and nerves. The siege commenced with coordinated attacks on the Residency's perimeter. Rebel cannon fire pounded the walls, sending dust and debris into the courtyards. Small parties attempted to breach gates, only to be met with disciplined musket volleys and bayonet charges. The defenders were disciplined, their training allowing them to hold the line despite being vastly outnumbered. But the psychological weight of constant bombardment was immense. Families huddled together in cellars, praying that the walls would hold, while soldiers faced the unrelenting roar of cannon and musket fire, knowing each day could be their last. As the days turned into weeks, the garrison began to feel the strain of isolation. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition were limited, and with each passing day, the rebels' determination seemed to grow stronger. Disease and exhaustion took a quiet toll on the defenders, yet they clung to the hope that reinforcements from nearby British posts would arrive in time. Officers, including Lawrence, worked tirelessly, moving through the Residency, inspecting fortifications, distributing supplies, and inspiring soldiers to endure. Their presence was a crucial anchor, a reminder that discipline and courage could withstand even overwhelming odds. Despite the severity of the siege, the rebels were not unified. They were often disorganized, striking in waves, but failing to coordinate effectively over the larger city. This gave the defenders a narrow edge, allowing them to repel attacks and fortify weak points. However, each victory came at a price. Casualties mounted, and every lost man intensified the grim awareness that the garrison was trapped, surrounded, and running out of time. Morale was tested daily, with whispers among civilians and soldiers alike. Could the walls hold for 147 days, or would this defense crumble under relentless pressure? By the third week, the siege had become a grim rhythm, cannon fire at dawn, musket volleys throughout the day, and an uneasy, haunted night punctuated by distant screams. The Residency, though still standing, had transformed into a cage where survival demanded constant vigilance. Families and soldiers shared a fragile sense of unity, bound together by fear and necessity. Every decision, from rationing food to assigning watch duties, carried life-or-death consequences. Amid the chaos, Lawrence remained a figure of authority and calm, though even he could sense the tipping point approaching. The siege was no longer a test of strategy alone. It had become a test of human endurance, resolve, and courage. Every hour, the garrison felt the growing pressure, the creeping realization that their defenses could falter, and with it, the lives of hundreds could be lost. And as the days dragged on, it became terrifyingly clear, even the strongest walls could not hold forever. Behind the high walls of the Residency, survival became a battle of endurance as much as of arms. As the Siege of Lucknow dragged into its third week, the residents inside the fortified compound quickly realized that defending the city was only part of the struggle. They now had to endure the harsh realities of life under constant threat. The Residency, once a place of relative order and civility, had become a claustrophobic fortress. Soldiers and civilians alike faced relentless fear, hunger, disease, and the psychological strain of seeing death strike daily from enemy guns. Every hour was a test, and every day demanded courage beyond ordinary limits. Rations became a constant concern. Supplies of fresh food dwindled quickly, leaving the defenders to subsist on whatever could be preserved. Officers meticulously managed stores, distributing small portions of rice, flour, and dried meat. Clean water was equally precious. Wells inside the Residency were guarded and rationed, with women and children often bearing the burden of collecting it under the watchful eye of soldiers. Hunger gnawed at the garrison as intensely as the cannon fire outside, weakening bodies already stressed by sleepless nights and relentless vigilance. Disease emerged as an insidious enemy. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera spread rapidly through the crowded walls. Soldiers fell ill, civilians grew weak, and medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat wounds sustained from the ongoing bombardment. Bandages were reused, medicines were scarce, and every new case heightened the grim awareness that survival depended not only on fending off bullets and shells, but also on maintaining fragile health in near-impossible conditions. Amid the fear and deprivation, discipline became the garrison's lifeline. Soldiers drilled regularly, maintained fortifications, and patrolled the walls. their military precision preventing the rebels from exploiting weaknesses. Officers like Sir Henry Lawrence and John Inglis worked to maintain morale, often moving quietly from one group to another, offering encouragement, issuing orders, and keeping the defenders focused on the grim task of survival. For civilians, the soldiers' presence was a lifeline, providing reassurance that, despite the chaos outside, some structure remained within the walls. Daily life was punctuated by the sounds of war. Cannon blasts shook walls, musket fire rattled windows, and the cries of the wounded echoed through corridors. Nights were especially harrowing. Darkness brought uncertainty, and even brief silence could trigger panic. Families huddled together in basements and cellars, listening for the telltale signs of an imminent attack. Children, often too young to fully understand the horrors surrounding them, were forced to witness death, fear, and exhaustion in a way that no child should ever endure. Yet, even in this desperate environment, small acts of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared rations with civilians, women tended to the wounded, and letters were secretly written to loved ones far away. Humor, whispered in quiet corners, offered fleeting relief from despair. These tiny gestures of resilience provided hope, however fragile, and reminded everyone inside the Residency that they were not merely prisoners, they were still human beings fighting for survival. By the end of the third week, the garrison had begun to feel the true weight of the siege. Mental and physical exhaustion were constant companions, and the relentless attacks from the rebels tested every ounce of patience, courage, and discipline. Survival was no longer simply about defending walls. It was about enduring the endless days of uncertainty, maintaining cohesion, and finding hope in a world collapsing around them. But as the rebels adjusted their strategy, the walls themselves would no longer guarantee safety. Every day brought new horrors, and the walls that once felt secure now seemed perilously thin. By the fourth week of the siege, the defenders of Lucknow were beginning to feel the crushing weight of both time and circumstance. The rebels had learned from the garrison's previous tactics, adapting their strategy to exploit weaknesses. They intensified their bombardment, targeting vulnerable walls, gatehouses, and any sections where soldiers could be seen. Mortar shells tore through the courtyards, sending clouds of smoke and debris into the air, while snipers picked off anyone attempting to repair fortifications. The garrison realized with growing horror that the enemy's patience matched their own, and every hour of respite became a rare luxury. Inside the Residency, tensions ran high. Soldiers, exhausted from long hours of duty and minimal rest, began to show signs of strain. Arguments erupted over scarce resources, and fatigue heightened emotions to a dangerous degree. Yet, despite these internal pressures, discipline remained paramount. Officers enforced strict schedules, ensuring that men rotated between guard duty, repairs, and rest. Every lapse in vigilance could prove fatal, and each soldier understood that their personal endurance directly influenced the survival of hundreds of others. Food shortages became critical. Rations that were already meager dwindled further, as supplies were consumed faster than anticipated due to unforeseen casualties and the growing population inside the walls. Officers devised intricate rationing systems, distributing portions with meticulous care. Still, hunger gnawed at soldiers and civilians alike, sapping strength and dulling the senses. Even the smallest misstep, a miscalculated portion, or an exhausted sentry, could trigger disaster. The garrison began to understand that survival depended not only on courage, but also on meticulous planning and cooperation. Disease continued to spread, exacerbated by close quarters, poor sanitation, and the heat of the Indian summer. Fever, dysentery, and cholera struck indiscriminately, claiming soldiers and civilians alike. Medical officers worked tirelessly, but their efforts were limited by scarce supplies and overwhelming need. Every new illness heightened the sense of fragility within the walls. The defenders were fighting on two fronts, against the rebels outside and the invisible enemy of sickness within. Meanwhile, the rebels' strategy evolved. They established siege works, dug trenches, and set up artillery positions with alarming efficiency. They targeted supply lines, intercepting messages and attacking foraging parties. It became clear that the garrison could not simply wait for reinforcements. They were trapped, forced into a war of attrition where every day weakened their position. The psychological strain was immense. Men who had faced battle in the open now faced an enemy that was patient, organized, and determined to wear them down. Despite the mounting pressure, acts of heroism emerged. Soldiers and civilians risked their lives to repair walls under fire, carry supplies to the wounded, and maintain morale. Officers like John Inglis demonstrated remarkable courage, rallying men in the most desperate moments, turning despair into determination. These acts did more than preserve lives. They reminded the garrison why they continued to fight, why surrender was not an option. As the siege entered its 5th week, it became painfully clear that the Residency's walls could only hold for so long. The rebels were relentless, their numbers growing as the city joined the uprising, and the defenders' exhaustion deepened with every passing day. Every cannon blast and musket volley reminded them that their situation was precarious, that one misstep could unravel all they had fought to preserve. With walls cracking under relentless assault, the garrison faced a terrifying truth. The siege was far from over, and Britain's defense might not survive another week. In the darkest hours, courage became the only weapon left to defy an unstoppable tide. As the Siege of Lucknow stretched into its 6th and 7th weeks, the defenders faced a reality that few could have imagined. The walls of the Residency were no longer just fortifications. They were lifelines, fragile shields against overwhelming forces. Each day brought new assaults, yet within the garrison, acts of bravery and selflessness illuminated the bleak landscape, proving that even in desperation, humanity could endure. Officers and soldiers displayed extraordinary courage. Under constant fire, they repaired crumbling walls, reinforced barricades, and carried ammunition to the front lines. One particularly daring sortie involved a group of soldiers moving through the rebel-held streets to deliver much-needed supplies to a section of the Residency under heavy bombardment. Despite the enemy's sniper fire and the deafening roar of cannons, they completed their mission, sustaining not only the physical defenses but also the morale of the garrison. These acts were more than duty. They were defiance against overwhelming odds. Civilians, too, became part of the struggle. Women and children assisted with medical care, carried food and water, and tended to the wounded. In some instances, entire families participated in makeshift fortification work, shoveling earth and stacking stones to strengthen the walls. The boundaries between soldier and civilian blurred, as survival demanded collective effort. Each individual contributed, and each act of bravery inspired others to continue, despite fear and exhaustion. Yet the siege was relentless. Every success came at a cost. The rebels intensified their tactics, using artillery to destroy key positions, while small groups infiltrated the perimeter under cover of darkness. Casualties mounted. Soldiers fell to musket fire, civilians were injured by collapsing walls, and disease continued to claim the weak. Each loss was a blow to morale, but the garrison persisted, their resolve hardened by necessity. The stakes were immense. Surrender would mean massacre, while resistance required near impossible endurance. One of the most harrowing episodes occurred when a rebel attack breached a section of the Residency's outer wall. Panic threatened to spread, but officers quickly organized a counterattack. Men surged forward, bayonets raised, driving the intruders back under a hail of musket fire. The courage displayed in those moments became legend, a symbol of defiance against overwhelming numbers. Soldiers risked their lives repeatedly, knowing that any hesitation could cost hundreds their lives. It was in these moments that the spirit of the garrison revealed itself, unyielding, resourceful, and terrifyingly resilient. Amid the chaos, communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. Letters were smuggled through secret channels, and messengers risked their lives to bring news of reinforcements or relief. The defenders clung to these fragments of hope, understanding that survival depended on the arrival of relief from outside the city. Each day without contact intensified the tension, heightening anxiety and uncertainty. Despite the exhaustion, despair never fully dominated the Residency. Every act of heroism, whether repairing a wall under fire, saving a wounded comrade, or sharing the last scraps of food, reaffirmed the defenders' determination. Even as the rebels' attacks grew more sophisticated, the garrison adapted, demonstrating ingenuity, courage, and unbreakable resolve. The siege had become a test not only of military skill, but of human endurance and the strength of the human spirit. But even the bravest hearts could not ignore the creeping dread. The walls were weakening, and the siege's end was nowhere in sight. After weeks of relentless fire, hunger, and fear, the defenders of Lucknow finally glimpsed a glimmer of hope. As the siege dragged into its 10th week, the garrison's endurance had been pushed to its absolute limit. The walls, scarred and battered from constant bombardment, bore witness to the relentless struggle within and outside the Residency. Men were exhausted, civilians terrified, and disease had claimed many lives. Yet, amidst the chaos, the spirit of the defenders had not been extinguished. Every day had been a battle, not just against the enemy, but against despair, hunger, and the seemingly endless stretch of time. The turning point came with news of approaching reinforcements. Scouts and messengers, braving the dangerous streets of a city under siege, carried word that relief forces were moving closer. For the first time in weeks, a cautious optimism took root inside the Residency. Soldiers, weary but determined, rallied for what would become the final stand. Fortifications were reinforced one last time, supplies carefully distributed, and wounded comrades tended to as best as possible. Every action was imbued with renewed urgency. The garrison knew the coming hours would decide their survival. When the relief force finally arrived, it was met with a mix of jubilation and grim reality. The garrison had endured nearly 147 days of continuous siege, and the city they defended had been transformed into a battlefield. Streets were littered with debris, and the air still smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and decay. Families who had huddled in fear finally emerged from cellars and basements, and soldiers, many barely able to stand, were able to leave their posts without the immediate threat of enemy fire. The sense of relief was profound, but tempered by the immense cost of survival. The aftermath revealed the human toll. Hundreds of defenders had fallen, many more were wounded, and disease had further decimated the population. The rebels had also suffered heavily, but the garrison had survived against overwhelming odds. For Britain, the defense of Lucknow became a symbol of endurance and heroism, a testament to discipline, courage, and the human capacity to endure unimaginable pressure. Officers who had led the defense, like Sir Henry Lawrence and John Inglis, were remembered for their strategic brilliance and unwavering resolve. In the months that followed, the story of Lucknow's siege spread across the empire. Letters, reports, and newspaper accounts painted a picture of a garrison under unimaginable pressure, holding its ground against relentless attacks and demonstrating acts of courage that would inspire generations. The siege became more than a military engagement. It was a narrative of survival, leadership, and human endurance under extreme adversity. Yet even in victory, the memory of the siege remained vivid. Survivors carried with them the scars of battle, the loss of friends and family, and the trauma of prolonged fear. The Residency's walls, though repaired, bore permanent reminders of the siege's intensity, and the city of Lucknow itself carried the legacy of rebellion and resistance that had forever changed British strategy in India. The Siege of Lucknow ultimately stood as a defining moment in the history of the British Empire in India. It demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of human endeavor, highlighting the extraordinary courage required to endure 107 days of relentless pressure. Britain's defense had been tested to the limit, and though the walls had held, it was the courage, ingenuity, and unyielding spirit of those inside that ensured survival. The siege had ended, but its lessons, stories of heroism, and the memory of those lost would echo through history for generations to come.